All right. Um, Blockchain and AI. So let's get into it. Why am I making this video? Because buzzwords, think about all the views I'm going to get, and because we know the two have to have something in common. We know that we count as an intelligent system, right? So AI aside, this is about intelligent systems. And we know that currency helps us to solve problems as an intelligent system, helps us to work together. And we know that blockchain can be used as part of a currency. So what do the two really have to do with one another? What exactly is the connection, right? Let's first describe our relationships as nodes in the network. Because we compete for resources, our relationships are largely zero-sum. We can cooperate with one another, but this takes trust, which involves risk. It's in our best interest to be trusted, but it's also in our best interest to not trust others. A connection between two nodes means the nodes have a reason to cooperate, or that the relationship is a net positive, even if there is some competitive element to it. Our goal is to grow the network, increase the amount of connections between nodes, and increase the amount of nodes. We must make it so that others predict that interacting with us is in their best interest, whether it is or isn't. For instance, if I'm applying for a job, I need you to pay me, whether it's in your best interest or not. Hopefully it is, but I'll take the money anyway, and so will anyone else. Assuming that others are doing the same, we cannot simply trust the data our senses input. Instead of trusting data, we need to validate it. And how do we validate data, right? Assuming that we all have a responsibility to solve for our benefit, when we observe someone taking on risk or enduring a negative of some sort, we can assume they predict the venture will be worth it, and therefore it may be worth it for us as well. If we observe someone taking risk or accruing negative, we can call this risk-validated data or negatively validated data. To facilitate risk validation is to facilitate effective communication between nodes in our intelligence system, or in other words, to grow the network. So how do we facilitate negative validation? How do we help make it happen? Before money, we had a promise-based economy, right? Jill promises to grow potatoes for Abby, in return for Abby helping Jill build a house. Jill has a house, and Abby does not have potatoes yet. So let's break down the relationship and values in terms of risk at this point, right? This is the point after Abby helped Jill build a house, but before Jill gave potatoes back to Abby in return. Abby took on risk of providing her time to Jill. She has other things to do, and she took time away from solving those problems to help Jill. And this is negative/risk, helps us to put a value on potatoes, right? And what we mean by this is Billy, observing what's happening, now thinks maybe he should take on some risk for potatoes. He now knows about how much risk because he watched Abby, and that potatoes are more valuable than carrots because people generally risk less for carrots than for potatoes, right? Now we have the idea of value coming up. Jill is incentivized to grow potatoes for Abby because if she doesn't, her future needs may not be met because her reputation is ruined. Or in other words, taking risk on Jill's behalf is not worth it, and Billy, who builds fences, may not agree to build a fence around Jill's farm, which she will need because he doesn't trust that he'll get paid in potatoes, right? Jill is incentivized also to not grow potatoes for Abby because the less work, the better, and the more potatoes Jill has for herself, the more likely she will survive the winter. Remember, she has to part with potatoes in order to pay Abby, right? That Jill keeps her promise then is mostly based on circumstances. If a harsh winter comes, people in the village stop keeping their promises, right? and the entire economy breaks down, and the village may not survive because of this. And it's not only that the value of things break down, meaning if Abby doesn't get paid back in potatoes, things are no longer worth it. There's no more how much risk should I put in terms of potatoes or in the return for Abby's work any longer. It's just not a part of why we do things anymore. But it's also, the worst part about it is that work doesn't get done. Work that's necessary for survival doesn't get done. And you will have a decrease in population in a given area, or a decrease in nodes and connections in our network. So how do we solve this problem? Right, so far we have verbal promises. Because potatoes require work, potatoes can't be counterfeited. Potatoes are negatively validated data. Since work takes time and effort, making it a negative. It takes effort to grow potatoes. It takes time. It takes land. It takes tilling. Whatever you need to do to grow them, it's work. And if you can write valid promises such that they are difficult to counterfeit, you can model that same proof of work or negative and simply exchange one for the other. Meaning, because they took the same amount of work as the potatoes, because they were exchanged for the potatoes, they essentially take the place of a potato in Abby's collection. Abby has those instead of potatoes, and she trades them back for potatoes at some point. Right, so where are we now? So let's say that Abby collected a promise to grow 50 pounds of potatoes from Jill. It has her name on it. If the winter gets harsh, Jill can never say she never made the promise, because the promises are difficult to counterfeit. This is at the core of these promises. This means that a winter has to be really harsh for Abby not to get her potatoes. We've increased the threshold for how bad things must get before the network starts to degrade. We've increased stability slightly. If Abby needs a fence from Billy, she can pay him with Jill's promises, so that Billy can simply present Jill with a promise that she wrote to Abby and collect potatoes at some point. This also increases stability and survival rate of the village, because even though Abby doesn't do anything Billy needs, they can still have a cooperative and not adversarial relationship. So a connection between her and Billy is created where there was none before. The problem is that over time, the value of a promise goes down, because if it's almost winter and Jill did not deliver the potatoes, the odds that she will do so before winter are now much smaller than at the date of issuance. This affects Abby and Billy's relationship as well, because the less Jill's promises are worth, the less Abby can get in return for them from Billy. It's important, though, to note that before written promises, Abby could tell Billy that Jill now owes him 50 pounds of potatoes. They can still exchange promises, but in that system, we are dependent on people's memory, which requires trust and is therefore much less stable. So that's the big innovation with these written promises that are difficult to counterfeit. So we know where we need to go from here, right? How do we go from written individual promises that have an identity and a date attached to them to dollars, to currency, right? At the heart of these promises is that Abby's promises and Jill's promises are essentially two different currencies. Ignoring anti-counterfeit measures, there are two different proof of work / negative / risk, whatever you want to call it. Abby's home building and Jill's potato growing. This is a problem. If along comes Mark and he says that he can make data that is even more difficult to counterfeit, and it doesn't have a name or a date attached to it, would Jill, Abby, and Billy accept it in return for their services? Right? When we earlier said that a promise is difficult to counterfeit, what we meant is that each promise does some work to make this happen, or each person does some work to make this happen. Jill is a great artist, for instance, and she draws a picture on the back of her promises that no one else can draw quite as well, and people recognize it as hers. Abby has a unique signature, and she makes the ink from a secret recipe that no one else knows, and it helps hers to stand out. What Mark is promising is that people no longer have to do this kind of work. Mark's data can be traded for anything because it's not attached to anyone's product. If Abby wants to trade some Jill promises, the other person has to have a need for potatoes because Jill only makes potatoes, affecting the value of the promises negatively. Any kind of service or product can be traded for Mark promises, which makes them more valuable as a means of getting what you need. As soon as one person accepts Mark promises, because it is difficult to counterfeit, it automatically has value. For instance, Mark gave Chris some Mark promises and said, "You can come back to me and I'll accept my own Mark promises back and I will give you some potatoes in return." If Mark then goes to Jill and says, "Chris accepts these in case you need a wheelbarrow because he makes wheelbarrows, can I pay you some potatoes with my new Mark promises? Can I pay for some potatoes with my new Mark promises that can be exchanged to Chris for a wheelbarrow?" She said she is highly incentivized to accept this because she's tired of drawing and thinks maybe Abby is tired of making all that purple ink. In other words, the predicted future acceptance of a more convenient currency is an important indicator of its value. That's what I'm trying to say here. At the heart of Mark promises is his anti-counterfeit measure. And if he solves this problem efficiently, this little village of people, which is also a network of intelligence systems and a system itself, will increase its survival rate. Because the promises are not attached to dates, people, or specific products and services, the amount of connections between nodes is maximized, assuming each node has some output that can serve as input to another node that increases that node's output. Right? As long as someone makes something that someone needs, not any particular, but anyone in the village needs, they automatically have a connection with that person, with actually everyone, because he has dollars that can be traded for anything. Right? This is what we're trying to do. The data between nodes, therefore, is now validated. And so data validation is key to intelligent systems design. This is the heart of what I'm trying to say here. Blockchain helps to validate data between people, and this is extremely important for people to get along and to do work that benefits one another. Going on from Mark promises, right? Everything's going good until you realize how much power Mark has. Like the other villagers, he also competes against them for resources, and so he's incentivized to break their trust. Him being the keeper of his anti-counterfeit mechanism, he has the ability to just print currency. It costs him something, but not like building a house or growing potatoes, right? And he wants Abby to build him a new house, and because she's the only house builder, she charges him 100x her normal rate. He doesn't have a promise paying whatever price she wants because it costs him almost nothing. And as long as Mark wants new houses, no new houses in the village get built except for Mark's. Another way of saying this is that the price of houses skyrockets. So all the Mark promises that everyone has are actually worth much less now because this happened. He also likes strawberries. He pays all the strawberry growers 100x their normal price, and so no one in the village can get strawberries unless they're really rich like Mark, right? So Mark promises as data become invalid. Although difficult to counterfeit, they are no longer proof of work or negative or risk, which this was the point altogether. So without going into detail of how a blockchain works, we can simply say that a currency which does not depend on a centralized negative mechanism proof of negative mechanism has a very positive effect on whatever intelligence system uses it for data validation. So, in other words, what I meant by AI was intelligent systems design, and what I meant by blockchain is data validation. But that's essentially what those things are. And if you want to go further, let's say you want to build smart robots that you just want to throw at a problem, right? You want to have these human-like robots that you build. They have some learning mechanism, something in them is intelligent and they can learn to do things. And you just want them to build a house, right? You're going to need to validate the data that is exchanged between each robot and perhaps even within the robot itself. Considering that our brains have multiple parts to them which compete against one another for resources, just like people in an intelligence network. And in order for the parts of our brain to communicate effectively, the data between each part needs to be validated in the same way that it needs to be validated between people in the network. And so anyways, data validation is extremely key to intelligent systems design. And this is a small introduction to intelligent systems design. Thank you.